The PS2 is a system that doesn't really need an introduction, which works for me because it means I don't have to write one. For years, it's been the best-selling video game console of all time, and it'll continue to be so if Sony keeps revising its sales figures. With over 160 million units sold, a library of over 4,000 games, and 2 major versions, each with their own submodels, collecting for such a legendary system can be pretty daunting. I'm hoping this video can act as a starting point for those interested in starting a collection, and maybe just a fun trip down memory lane for longtime fans. The PS2 had probably one of the strongest starting positions that a console can have, directly following a system that sold over 100 million units. You have to be a fucking imbecile to mess that up.
So today, welcome to the world of Wii U.
That was really bad.
The original PlayStation demolished its competition, selling approximately 102 million units during the 5th generation, while the silver medal that generation went to the N64 with 32 million sales. The original PlayStation launched at the competitive price of $299 and could also play music CDs. Sony decided to expand on this with the console's successor. The PS2 was the second console of the 6th generation, releasing a few months after Sega's Dreamcast. And while the PS2 may have been more expensive than the Dreamcast and GameCube, it had a major advantage in the form of DVD playback. Back in 2000, a standard DVD player from a trusted brand like Sony or Panasonic could cost anywhere between $200 and $300, with higher quality models potentially reaching $600. If you saw a box for $299 that could play DVDs and Buster Block, it was a no-brainer. Fair enough, the Xbox also supported DVDs, but you had to buy a separate remote to enable the feature. The PS2 would let you watch Shrek 2 in glorious 480p right out of the box. The PS2 was also one of the first consoles to support online play. This was before the days of a standard network infrastructure like PSN, so building and maintaining each game's online functionality was the responsibility of the game publishers. The last official PS2 online server was for Final Fantasy XI, which shut down on March 31st, 2016. But there are servers still being hosted by fans, so games like EverQuest, Midnight Club 3 and PES 6 can still be played online right now. PS2 console was discontinued in 2013, with it receiving its final game in November 2013 in the form of PES 2014. And despite production stopping in 2013, Sony stopped reporting PS2 sales numbers a year prior, with the sales figure in March 2012 sitting at 155 million units. And in November 2024, Sony reported that the PS2 actually sold 160 million units, which was awfully convenient seeing that the Switch was closing in on 150 million sales at that time.
That's a nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
The PS2 has 2 main models. The fanbase refers to them as PS2 Fat and PS2 Slim, or as I like to call them, PS2 Bear and PS2 Twink. While these are the 2 models that everyone thinks of, they each have their own sets of submodels with their own revisions of the hardware. While I don't think the difference is as stark as the PS3 model difference is, I'll go through the things that I think most people will find the most helpful when deciding what system to go for. Quick side note to avoid any confusion, I've seen people write model numbers interchangeably between 390XX and 3900X. It's just because the last 2 digits denote where the console's from, 00 for Japan, 01 for the US, 02 for Australia, and so on. Some PS2 models have a design flaw that can actually burn out the laser. This issue is known as the Mechacon crash, which occurs when the console's DSP, or digital signal processors, receive bad data from a damaged disc or a low quality bootleg. This causes the voltage of the tracking cards to increase to unsafe levels, and the laser being permanently damaged. The sources I've looked at for this video say that the models susceptible to this issue are the 390XX and the 500XX original models, and the 700XX slim models, but it's pretty rare with the 390XX. Fortunately, there's a solution for this known as the PIC Fix mod. It installs a chip that monitors the communication between the console's DSP and Mechacon, and it turns the console off as soon as the crash occurs, preventing the laser from being burned out. I'll link a video about the mod in the description because I don't really know that much about modding PS2s. With that out of the way, let's start looking at the PS2 models you might want to choose from. The original PS2 was released in 2000, and when compared to its slim counterpart, it looks fucking massive.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. And then... Oh fuck, okay!
I think the biggest advantages of choosing the original model are the reliability compared to the Slim, the increased modding potential, and the expansion slot which can be used for the network adapter, a hard drive, or hiding cigarettes from your parents. 390XX is the penultimate version of the chunky PS2 and is what you're going to see recommended the most online. Many sources say it's the most reliable for reading discs, but other sources also say that this is a myth spread by mod chip installers, so take that with a grain of salt. I know I mentioned that the 390XX is susceptible to the Mechacon crash, but the crash happened so infrequently on this model that it led people to think that the 500XX actually introduced the crash. And the 500XX is the last major version of the original PS2. While it's much more likely to burn its laser out, it does have its advantages. It's the only original model with an IR sensor that you also see on the Slim models. It lets you use a wireless DVD remote with the console. And people also report that the fans are much quieter on this revision. If you're not afraid of modding your console and a bit of soldering, this might actually be the move. Released in 2004, the PS2 Slim is one of my favourite console redesigns of all time. They took this big ass box and crammed it into something just slightly bigger than a game case. But with the reduced size comes trade-offs. The Slim has a disc door instead of a motorised disc tray, most models have an external power brick, and there's no space for a hard drive. But fortunately you can still play online thanks to the integrated Ethernet port. With such an elegant redesign and 4 years of learning from the original model, surely you can just pick up any PS2 Slim, right?
It's false. No way.
Not this time.
Yeah, the Slim comes with its own lineup of issues. The PS2 Slim was notorious for scratching game discs. Because of the Slim's chassis design, the ribbon cable in the disc tray could sometimes touch the disc, scratching it as it spins up. Once again, you can mod your console to fix this issue. Some people report using adhesive or a 3D printed clip to hold the cable in place, while others recommend replacing the ribbon cable with one you can find on eBay. The only model that can't scratch your discs is the 790XX. The Mechacon crash makes its return with the 700XX model, and it's much more common than the 390XX, so I would avoid these entirely. The 750XX was the first PS2 model without hardware-based backwards compatibility, since Sony replaced the PS1 CPU model included in the PS2. Because of this, the console could experience compatibility issues with PS1 and even some PS2 games. Personally, my model is a silver 750XX and I've never really had any issues with it. As I said earlier, the 790XX is the only Slim model that can't scratch your discs. The internal shell has a slightly different design which stops the cable from moving. But for some reason, they decided to go back to the last design for the final model, the 900XX. This model has an internal power supply so there's no power brick, a slightly redesigned case, and it's almost impossible to software mod. Sony patched out the vulnerability you could use to add homebrew or extract the BIOS for emulation. But this won't really be an issue if you're just planning on playing your discs and doing nothing else. There was also a car mount design for the PS2 Slim. It was attached to the ceiling and would let people in the back seat play games to pass the time on long journeys. Or you can play Jak and Daxter if looking at the motorway ever gets boring. The last model of the PS2 is the PSX. Only released in Japan, the PSX was a PS2 with a built-in DVR. For my British viewers, it's a PS2 with a Sky Plus box in it. It sold poorly, likely due to the high price point, and Sony cancelled the system before it could make its way to the West. Overall, the fat PS2 is the console with the most capabilities, so if you're looking for one of those, I'd go for the 390XX. And if you don't care about hard drive support and want to prioritise space, get a Slim 790. The PS2's library is comprised of just over 4,000 titles. There's no way that I'm going to mention everyone's favourite, so just like with my other collection guides, if you're mad about me not including your favourite game, tell everyone else in the comments, you might introduce someone to their new favourite. I'm going to organise this list by genre just because of how diverse the lineup is. Starting with platformers, the PS2 was a unique console because it was the only place you could watch the simultaneous rise and fall of multiple series. Games like Ratchet and Clank and Jak and Daxter were fresh and fun, while those developers' previous properties of Spyro and Crash were somewhat struggling.
Wrath of Cortex didn't do as well as we'd hoped, and...
Other titles to mention here are the Sly Cooper series, Ape Escape, Sonic Heroes, Shadow the Hedgehog, and SpongeBob SquarePants Battle for Bikini Bottom. Action feels like a really vague name for a genre. Obviously you have stuff like God of War, the classic Grand Theft Autos, Kingdom Hearts and Devil May Cry, but then there's action in Metal Gear Solid 2, Splinter Cell Chaos Theory and Hitman Blood Money. Or do they count as stealth games? And what's Tomb Raider? The PS2 was also a great place for racing games, with it hosting kart races like Crash Nitro Kart and Crazy Frog Racing, while also being the home to more grounded games like Gran Turismo 3 A-Spec, 4 Prologue and 4, Burnout, Midnight Club 3, and Driver 3. Some of the greatest JRPGs of all time call the PS2 home. Final Fantasy X, X-2, 11 and 12, Dragon Quest VIII, Shin Megami Tensei 3, and of course...
LeBron James.
Scream if you love Persona.
The early 2000s saw an explosion in the number of anime games making it to the West. Franchises like Dragon Ball, Yu-Gi-Oh!, One Piece, Naruto, and Full Metal Alchemist got several games on PS2. I'll try to keep this section short and only mention a few titles. Dragon Ball Z Budokai and Budokai Tenkaichi series and Infinite World were fun and are still held in high regard today. Yu-Gi-Oh! Had GX Tag Force Evolution, which was essentially the card game, The Duelist of the Roses, which was loosely based on the card game, and Capsule Monster Coliseum, which said, "What card game?" Naruto had the Ultimate Ninja series, and even Grappler Baki got a game. Expect a video on that at some point. There are still a lot of games exclusive to Japan, like Berserk Millennium Falcon Arc Chapter of the Holy Demon War and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Phantom Blood, but the second of those has an English fan translation available online. I think this was probably the golden age of licensed video games. In the early 2000s, a movie wasn't worth seeing if it didn't have a questionable tie-in video game. The Raimi Spider-Man trilogy, Hulk 2003, The Incredibles, Barnyard, Wallace and Gromit. Everything's fair game here. And then there's the Simpsons games, Hit and Run, Road Rage and the Simpsons game, which is somehow some of the best games on the console. Oh yeah, and there was a Family Guy game too.
Good thing my bribes at City Hall paid off.
Hey, don't forget to put in these hooks.
Why?
Because some infant gave me $100.
This part of the script is going to get really long if I don't cut it off here, so here are some other things that I want to mention before moving on. Eco, Shadow of the Colossus, Parappa the Rapper 2, the Buzz Quiz series, Resident Evil 4, Time Splitters, Bully, Star Wars Battlefront 2, Okami, and last but not least, the WWE SmackDown vs. Raw series. Anything I missed can be yelled about in the comments. One of the best things about picking up a console 20 years late is that there are so many aftermarket options that make you experience the best it can be. If you don't like the DualShock 2 or you can't find one that isn't covered in years worth of Dorito dust, the number of third-party options here is actually ridiculous. I went with the Defender from Retro Fighters, and it's a great wireless controller that works on both the PS2 and the PS3. Plus the dongle for the PS2 looks like a memory card, and I love that attention to detail, it blends right in. If you do decide to go with this one, make sure you get the original Defender and not the one labelled as Bluetooth, which doesn't work with the PS2. I made this mistake and they just wouldn't let me return it. Since the PS2 was designed when DVDs were the newest format around, the PS2 outputs an image at the glorious resolution of 480i. And the RCA cables that came with it may not be compatible with a modern TV. Some don't even have the red, white and yellow ports anymore. You can get around this with a cheap HDMI converter from Amazon, but your mileage may vary. If you're really serious about playing on original hardware, I'd recommend one of RetroTink's upscalers. Everyone I've seen online who has one swears by it, but I just couldn't justify spending that much on an upscaler. And now to address the emulator-shaped elephant in the room. PS2 games are very easy to emulate. Any modern PC or something from the past few years will eat the PS2's library for breakfast. The main PS2 emulator is PCS-X2 and it's my personal go-to. But it needs a PS2 BIOS file before it can run anything, and you have to dump those from an actual console, which is what I did. Can you find it online? I don't know, probably. But you can dump your BIOS to a flash drive using a free MacBoot memory card or other methods you can read about on the PCS-X2 website. After this, it's just a matter of finding the game files. Can you download them? Once again, I couldn't tell you whether you can or cannot find the game files online. You can dump the raw ISO files from your physical disks using an optical drive and a free program like ImageBurn. Then you just add your ISO folder to the emulator as a directory and you can play your games in great quality. Emulation is somewhat of a hot topic to debate online. I'm of the opinion that if something isn't being actively sold or isn't readily available for a reasonable price due to the secondhand market being just the worst, then go for it. My favourite part of making these videos is looking at the cool special edition consoles. When it comes to special editions, the original models are actually kind of basic. You have recolors like gold and silver, translucent black and blue consoles exclusive to Japan, and then there's this bright green Axe body wash collaboration that was a prize for a competition in Germany. The Slim didn't get much more. Once again, you have your basic colours, there's a Final Fantasy X-2 edition. Oh yeah, and a fucking BMW! Designed to celebrate the release of Need for Speed Most Wanted, only one of these consoles exists and it's fucking insane. Like the disc tray is the bonnet of the car and you turn it on using a key. While most of the console variations are kind of boring, the controllers really do pick up the slack. You have the famous Resident Evil chainsaw controller, the iconic SpongeBob controllers, and the Buzz controllers, but they also make controls for Final Fantasy X-2 in the shape of Yuna's pistols.
But it's a lucky thing I had my pieces.
Your pieces?
My guns.
Oh.
Anyway, I started blasting. Bang!
Wow.
Bang!
I missed out on the PS2's heyday in the early 2000s. I was living in the Nintendo bubble of the DS and the Wii. But as soon as I started making my own money with a paper round, I bought a silver PS2 Slim with a copy of Dragon Ball Z Budokai 2, and my family didn't see me for weeks. Making this video has actually made me go out and pick up some PS2 games that I never got the chance to play, so I hope it's been a helpful resource for aspiring collectors. If there's another console you want me to look at, let me know. And by the time I make the video, Sony will have probably announced that the PS2 hit 170 million.
smile.